Hey everybody, and welcome back to another lecture. In this lecture, we're going to write an API GET request method that retrieves all of the to-dos that we currently have in our database. This is awesome as our application is starting to come together and be a real-life application. Now to do this, the first thing we need to do is create a new function right under models.base.metadata.createAllBindEngine. This function is going to be called getDB for getDatabase. Inside the getDB, we're going to have a try and a finally where we create a session of our database, and then we close the database regardless if we get the session or not. We can create this function by saying def getDB try, and then inside the try, we will say db equals session local, yield db, finally db.close. Now it looks like we need to import our session local. So we just hover over this and we can say import session local from database. When we do this, session local will be added at the end of database and right after engine. And now we can rename this create database to read all. And now as the parameter, we need to now use dependencies. And how dependencies work is we want this function to execute, but it depends on the solution and execution of another method. So how we can start working with dependencies is up in FastAPI. Right after FastAPI, let's type in depends. And again, remember, depends stands for dependencies. And after our depends, we now need to import one more thing. So from SQLAlchemy.orm, we need to import session. We now need to pass in a parameter of db, which is of type session, which equals the dependency of our getDB function that we created. We can do that by typing in db session equals depends and as a parameter getDB. So now when this read all functionality gets executed, this will get executed after the getDB method gets executed and we create a session that we can work with within our function. This session is going to be inside db. So from here, let's just type in return db.query, and then as the parameter of query, we want to say of models.todos.all. Now let's open up our terminal, make sure you're in your virtual environment, and now let's cd into our to-do app. And now let's type in uvicorn main:\app --reload. And now let's open up our Swagger UI and refresh the page. And here we can see immediately all of our to-dos. Let's hop over to our docs. We have our read all functionality in API, which takes in no parameters. And if we say try it all out and execute, we get our curl execution of get at our URL and port. And we get our response body of all three of our to-dos within our database, which were go to the store, cut the lawn, and feed the dog. This is awesome. So we just created our own application and API that communicates with a database. So remember, we enhanced this functionality from create database to read all. We're saying we need a new parameter of DB, which is of type session, which depends on getting the DB. The reason we created the DB with a try and finally is that whether or not we get a DB instance or session, we always close the database. And then we return our DB session dot query, which is our way for us to write a query within our application so we can query our database. And we're saying of our models.todos table, let's return all records. This is awesome. Now that we created our first API, let's keep going and create APIs for all different types of instances for our to-dos. This wraps up this lecture, and I will see you in the next video. Hey everybody, and welcome back to another lecture. In this lecture, we're going to create a new API that can read a to-do based on a path parameter of a to-do ID passed along with the API. To do this, we want to create a new API. So I want to say @app.get, and as a parameter or URL, I'm going to say /to-do/to-do ID in brackets. And now as the function, I'm going to say async def read to do. And as the parameters, I'm going to say to do ID, which is of type int, which will match the path parameters. And then I'm going to create a new dependency of DB, which is of type session, which depends on getDB. And now the first thing we're going to do is create a variable called toDoModel, which is going to be equal to db.query. And as the parameters, again, I'm going to type in models.todos, which represents the to-dos table. And now I'm going to say .filter. And .filter allows you to now filter your SQL command to now navigate the records within a table. So my .filter's parameters are going to be models.todos.id equals to-do ID. So the to-do ID of the path parameter needs to match the record of the to-dos.id within the table. I then want to say .first. .first just means after it finds an element, it'll return that element or record. And using .first helps that we don't have to now navigate the entire database. And now I want to say if toDoModel is not none. So we did return a record from the database, then we want to return that toDoModel. If not, we want to raise a new HTTP exception. So let's type in raise HTTP exception and make sure we import HTTP exception from FastAPI. With the status code of 404 in the detail item not found. Let's now save the file, and now let's open up our Swagger documentation and refresh our page. We can immediately see that we have a new to-do of to-do/to-do ID. We have a path parameter that's now required. So let's try it out and pass in a to-do ID of 1. If we execute this, we can see that it returns pick up eggs, go to the store with the ID of 1. If we change this to 2, we now see that grass is getting long, ID 2. And lastly, if we say 3, we can see feed the dog, he is getting hungry with an ID of 3. However, if we pass in like 6 and execute, we'll get our raise HTTP exception of to-do not found. Now, just for development's sake, let's create a new function for our HTTP exception. So right under this, I'm going to say def HTTP exception. And in this function, I'm going to say the exact same thing of raise HTTP exception status code 404 with to do not found. And now within our read to do functionality, I'm going to remove this HTTP exception and just call our function of HTTP exception. If we save our file and we switch back to our docs and we refresh, and just for a quick check, we can say try it out. We can type in 2, execute. We get the to do with the ID of 2. And if we type in 6 again and execute, we'll get to do not found. The reason we did this and created a new function was for reusability. I'm sure later on we're going to have other methods and APIs that are going to have to do some kind of search of the records for to-dos and trying to find if we have an ID that matches. And each time the ID doesn't match in the future, we can just call this HTTP exception instead of retyping it every single time. This wraps up this lecture on how to find a to-do by the primary key, and I will see you in the next video.